World Insight coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, Japan's likely THAAD deployment raises tension with neighbors. Is the missile defense system a legitimate act of self-defense or unnecessary trigger for a regional arms showdown? And also, we are seeing two deadly explosions that hit Turkey over the weekend, which raises doubt of Ankara's ability to stave off military attacks. We begin today's show with the possible deployment of U.S. anti-ballistic missile shields called Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, in Japan. Tokyo is expected to make a decision by summer next year, and Japanese media say THAAD is likely to be deployed before 2018. So what prompts Japan to consider boosting anti-missile defenses, and how will it affect relations between Japan and neighboring countries? Before we go to our discussion, take a look at this.
Japan took its cue from South Korea, now seriously considering also setting up THAAD within its borders. Tokyo's interest in the state-of-the-art interceptor system is not surprising, as it already possesses considerably advanced missile defense capabilities, employing both Aegis-equipped ship-based Standard Missile 3 and Patriot Advanced Capability 3 interceptors. The THAAD system is expected to provide another layer to Japan's missile defenses by introducing the capability of disabling or shooting down ballistic missiles as they re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, which elude other systems. Japan was quick to cite the looming threat from the DPRK as the biggest reason for its renewed interest in THAAD. This year alone, Pyongyang has carried out over 18 separate ballistic missile tests, in addition to 2 nuclear device tests. But Tokyo's announcement does not sit well with its biggest neighbors. China urged Japan to play a constructive role in maintaining regional stability. Russia also suggested that Japan try to resolve differences with other countries through dialogue instead of military means. But opposition to Japan's possible THAAD deployment will most likely fall on deaf ears. Japan's National Defense Ministry held talks with Washington, D.C. after the Defense Shield was successfully deployed in 2008. Then in 2014, the government set up THAAD-compatible radar bandwidths. Japan's former defense minister discussed the idea with U.S. officials again during a visit to Hawaii in 2015. And the purchase was raised after Seoul announced its own plans to deploy THAAD. Japan plans to upgrade its defense capabilities as President-elect Donald Trump takes office in January next year. In his campaign, Mr. Trump said that U.S. allies should do more for their own military defense. In the past several years, Japan has raised military spending, especially with parliamentary efforts to change its pacifist constitution. Tokyo may have to think twice about upping the ante with the THAAD deployment, which will not only ruffle the feathers of its neighbors, but also raise tensions with the regional arms race.
So how sound is a decision to deploy THAAD in Japan? We are joined here in our Beijing studio, Mr. Teng Jianqun, Director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. In Hong Kong, we are joined by Yuichi Shimatsu, former editor of Japan Times. In Washington, D.C., we have on the phone Michael O'Hanlon, the Director of Research for Foreign Policy Program of the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen, for joining us on this discussion. First of all, Mr. Shimatsu, how far away from further deployment of the THAAD system in Japan? And exactly what is Japan, do you think, the Abe administration having in mind doing that?
Well, there's right now a committee in the defense sector of Japan, led by Tomomi Inada, the defense minister, to see about this deployment, and I think the attitude is very positive. The essential problem with that is that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has pushed to end, he's urged the United States to end its no first strike policy. And I think the problem with that and why he's trying to acquire it is because it provides this illusion that you can launch a strike, let's say a first strike against Pyongyang or North Korea, and that you'll be able to defend yourself from the retaliatory strike. So I think this is the thinking behind why they need a THAAD system. They need something a little bit fail-safe to reassure Parliament to reassure the defense sector and the citizens that they're safe if they attack.
Mr. Tang, though, China has been against this, of course, both THAAD system in South Korea and also in Japan. What exactly is China having in mind? Some say it does not really affect China because the degree that they deployed the THAAD system will not really violate the security of China.
Yeah, first I should say the Chinese officials in recent years have raised a tone against this program. From the ending of the Cold War, the United States actually initiated this program. They are going to deploy the missile defense system from Alaska to the Philippines. It's actually a defense link in this region, and I think this is a very important part for the U.S. military deployment in Northeast Asia and in Asia Pacific region. And I think the main purpose is to deteriorate or hurt the strategic stability among the nuclear weapon state, because of its radar system. It can give long-range surveillance against the targets in the mainland of China and in Russia. So I think this is really a bad program for the U.S. government to have such a deterioration of the stability among the countries.
Well, so much concern, Mr. O'Hanlon, it seems, from the Chinese side, the Japan further deployment of THAAD system. So can the U.S. afford not to do that together with Japan?
Well, I think it's pretty important that we stay focused on the threat here. I think all of the countries we're talking about, China, Japan, the United States, we all recognize that North Korea is a dangerous and extremist regime. I understand we have different relationships with North Korea. I think there are ways in which China's relationship could possibly be helpful. I'm not blaming China for the fact that North Korea is unpredictable and aggressive, but let's not forget this is an extremely dangerous organization or government. And yes, there are other tensions in the region as well between the big powers that we've been discussing, and a lot of complicated history. But I don't think those kind of tensions are the same as the threat we really face in a direct, serious, acute way from North Korea. So I support missile defense deployments, because I think we have to distinguish here between long-standing tensions and anxieties that the countries like Japan and China may have about each other, and the acute threat that is real and undeniable posed by a regime like North Korea's, which is just a whole different category. So I do think that the United States owes China a fair amount of explanation about nuclear force planning, and I admire China's restraint in its nuclear force planning, and I think we should do better to show restraint ourselves. But meanwhile, I think we have to protect ourselves from North Korea.
Mr. Tang, you want to respond to what Mr. O'Hanlon talking about the so-called long-term uncertain relationship among some of the countries, namely China, the United States, China, Japan, for example, and what he called the accused threat coming from DPRK. Obviously, he's saying, well, there should be a priority. Do you think his priority is correct?
Yeah, I think DPRK did pose a threat, especially with missile test and the nuclear test. It did give some negative impact on the regional peace and stability. But I don't think the missile system deployed by the United States only targeted at the DPRK. And this is actually a global project from the European continent. We also have witnessed the deployment of THAAD and some Patriot missile system in Romania and in Poland, and also sea-based missile interceptors. So this is actually a big program for the United States to squeeze the defense posture of of Russia and China.
Well, that's what you think about the United States. What about Japan? As we said, this is a very important player, of course, in the overall system. Japan has been investing heavily in military equipment in the past couple of years. Take a look at some of the numbers we have for you here. Earlier this year, the Japanese parliament approved the new controversial security law, allowing the country's self-defense forces more freedom in carrying out overseas operations. For 2017 fiscal year, Japan's military budget reached more than $44.5 billion US, a record high, of course, though it is hardly surprising since the Abe government has set an annual growth target of 8% from 2014 to 2018. Those are the numbers coming from Japan. Mr. Shimatsu, after looking at those numbers, many would wonder, what is this THAAD system's status in terms of Japan's ever-increasing interests in maximizing its defense and probably even offense capabilities?
Right. I think one of the problems Japan faces is that it lacks its own nuclear deterrence capability, and I think this is one of the reasons Donald Trump has urged Japan to do that, so that it will join this deterrent system. Nuclear deterrence did hold up throughout the Cold War. I think North Korea's actions are basically to establish itself within a deterrent system. It's not to seriously attack another country. The problem is Japan, of course, was a victim of the nuclear bombings. The public is very much against nuclear armament. So Japan, therefore, is investing in all sorts of other military technologies, conventional technologies, where it can strike back without nuclear power. And I think this is a real problem, because that tends to destabilize the existing system between the great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. So I think this is very destabilizing altogether.
Well, it might be destabilizing, but of course Japan has its own cards to play. So Mr. Shimatsu, before I go to the other guests, I want to push you with another question, which is, Mr. Abe, the Prime Minister, is about to visit Russia, likely to have a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the 15th. Russia, of course, is also an important player in terms of opposition to the THAAD system deployment. Tokyo willing to establish a closer relationship with Russia, that's what we all know, but will Russia be able to push it hard enough, and will Tokyo be able to listen to Moscow in this regard?
Well, one of the problems is this visit was planned very early on, but their talks in September did not go very well. Russia is not too interested in returning the northern territories to Japan, so this will be a fairly tense meeting, and no one's really expecting a lot to come out of it. Now, the problem is THAAD. It depends on where it's deployed, how far north that will go, whether it will interfere with Russia's ballistic nuclear capability in Siberia. A real question there. So this is kind of a wild card. Everyone's going to be watching. And the other problem is, of course, it's expensive. A full THAAD outfit with radar costs more than $1 billion, and that's more than the Tokyo government has spent on the Fukushima evacuees. So we're really hitting a point where push is coming to shove, and whichever way we go is going to be very, very decisive for stability all throughout the Western Pacific and the Northern Hemisphere.
Mr. Ohanan, having heard the other two panelists, I do want to ask you this question. You talk about the long term, you talk about the acute threats among countries here in Northeast Asia vis-a-vis relations with the United States, but there's one moving factor that, of course, is Mr. Donald Trump, the president-elect. Many know he is unpredictable, at least for now. So how much will what you have just said about the acute threat and the long-term threat really still, in terms of a priority, should be outlined in that way?
Well, you're certainly right that President-elect Trump is a wild card, especially in regard to East Asia. I see him trying to walk back some of his stronger campaign rhetoric in regard to NATO, for example, but on East Asia he continues to make news in regard to his willingness to challenge long-standing practices with China and others, as we heard even yesterday. So I do share some of that concern, and all I can really say to try to reassure people is a lot of us in the United States are going to be watching this very hard and trying to exercise whatever limited influence we may have to reduce the likelihood of the president-elect doing unwise things. But there is this degree of unpredictability. I fully share that concern. But I think that's all the more reason why, when it amounts to something that's fairly straightforward, protecting yourself from a real missile threat from a hostile and extremist country like North Korea, that we have to acknowledge that the United States and its allies have a reasonable case for deploying this. And yes, there are complicated matters that have to be factored in terms of the U.S., China, and Japan-China relationships. But at the end of the day, we really do need to protect ourselves against a regime like the DPRK's with its nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles.
Mr. Tang, the DPRK, of course, are just like us, watching very closely what Washington will come up with after January the 20th, Mr. Trump comes into power. Meanwhile, as Mr. O'Hanlon earlier mentioned, there are already strains, if I could use that word, at this moment between China and the president-elect, because he's talking about walking out of the 4 decades long existing framework. So, plus the further deployment of THAAD system, which China has originally been against. Will all of these factors urge China or push China to a certain corner, the degree that China might take further actions? And China is only one of the players. What about Russia? And what about actions, reactions, Japan, South Korea, the United States? Will there be a action, reaction, ever ferocious cycle that we are likely to see?
Yeah, it's really hard to give 100% prediction on the policy adopted by the president-elected.
Right.
And, he still has at least 40 days to be the president of the United States. During these days, I'm sure he will give some test of our policy, of U.S. policy in Taiwan issue, in DPRK issue, and I'm sure in the coming days he will continue this, saying,
So the question is, Mr. Tang, if I could ask very clearly, given all of these factors, we're not just talking about that because that's only one of those factors, but all of these together, what can be China's reaction? And how can China defend itself as it sees it?
First, I should say China's policy has been there for decades, as you mentioned just now. I'm sure China is being very patient to watch the rhetorics by the president-elected. And the second factor we should think about is the Chinese side will continue the exchanges with the president-elect on any issues related to the security, to the peace in this region. And this is actually a tough job for the two sides.
I understand the diplomatic part. China is doing that right now. But what about when it comes to defense? What about worst scenarios?
Yes. I think this is actually a very tough job for our PRA, and actually in recent weeks we have witnessed the flight training of our Air Force, just very close to the Taiwan island, and even in the South China Sea some military drills were carried out. This is actually a signal to the president-elect that China is well determined to safeguard its sovereignty, its peace and stability, and also the integrity of the country.
Let me ask you, Mr. Shimatsu, have you heard from your Chinese colleague, also your Washington counterpart? The thing is, whether Tokyo is willing to be a card of the United States with a possibly changing policy Washington has toward Japan. Does that give the Abe administration more momentum to do that? And yet, doing that would invite more cautious reactions and probably stronger reactions coming from China and Russia.
Well, so far the Japanese position is to try to develop a greater independence for the United States, realizing that the United States umbrella will not be there. I mean, there's been a drawdown of U.S. forces, and what Trump is saying is that there's going to be an increasing reluctance among the American public if there is actual conflict between Japan and China. I think the larger problem is the lack of we have obviously a huge arms race going on in Asia, all across Asia, but there's no forum, there's no dialogue really on arms control, on reducing this arms race and determining what the rules are that everyone's going to play by. So I think right now, each side is going to try to take advantage of this vacuum right now without an international system in Asia. And that's what Shinzo Abe is doing. He's going to arm up as much as he can and build up as far as he can go.
Right, Mr. O'Hanlon, in the U.S., of course, that is only going to invite further actions coming from the other countries. Everybody going to arm themselves as much as they can, on all possibilities they can. Arms race going on here in this part of the region and will be going on in the rest of the world as a result.
No, I think you should give countries in East Asia more credit, including China and Japan. You talked earlier about some of the new Japanese defense initiatives. Japan still only spends 1% of its gross domestic product on its military.
That's for now.
And it still has substantial constraints on the use of force. Yes, for now, but most of the discussions, like the one that you had earlier in this show, forget to mention that Japan is still at 1% of GDP. They imply that somehow the shackles are off. And that's simply not true. And it's worth remembering that. It's also worth giving China credit. China, even though it's having now a substantial defense buildup and has the second largest military budget in the world, it's still spending no more than 2% of GDP on its military, and probably less by most estimates. So I want to discourage this idea that East Asia is involved in some big arms race.
Military budget is one thing, but how the money is being spent, where it's being spent is another thing. Small-scale conflicts is already going to worth a big turnout in the overall change of the world we're talking about here in our world today. So it's not just the military budget, it's also where the money is going to be used, where the focus is. So Mr. O'Hanlon, what do you think about the possibility? I mean, how to prevent that? We have already seen a possibility of arms race already going on in this part of the world. And what role will U.S. eventually play? Of course, you don't have to be responsible for your president-elect, but really, what is the role that U.S. is aspired to be at this moment?
Well, first of all, I'm going to stick with my point earlier that not only are Japan and China showing restraint in the magnitude of their defense spending, I believe they are still both showing restraint in their behavior overall. Now, yes, China is flexing its muscles in some places, but frankly, from my point of view, that's somewhat understandable for a great country that has been so peaceful for so many years and in many ways less strong than it had been historically. And most of what I see, I try to reassure my American friends, many of whom are very worried about China's behavior in East Asia, in the East China Sea, South China Sea, that yes, both countries have to watch each other and look for ways to reassure, but we shouldn't exaggerate the problem. We shouldn't convince ourselves that we're already embarked on some big regional arms race when in fact that's not the case. So you're right, there are a lot of things we have to still watch, but let's not lose perspective on where we are today.
But the role of the United States, you still haven't answered. That's exactly what I want to ask you, Mr. O'Hanlon.
Well, I think part of the answer is indeed to encourage Japan to modify its policies only very gradually and as part of a collective security system, not with the interest of unilateral action. So that basic principle, I think we should try to retain.
We hope that can be done with the new president-elect. Thank you so much for the three of you gentlemen for being with us. Michael O'Hanlon in the U.S., Teresi Shimatsu from Japan originally, and also Teng Jianquan. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're watching World's Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Istanbul came under attack again over the weekend with deadly twin blasts. Why does Turkey seem powerless to stop these attacks? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight, coming to you Monday to Friday every day on CCTV News. Now let's turn to Turkey, where two explosions rocked central Istanbul on Saturday. The Kurdish militant group THAAD has claimed the responsibility for the bombings. Turkish President Erdogan held an emergency security meeting on Sunday to discuss measures against the PKK-affiliated group. Take a look.
Turkey is once again in mourning. Twin bombings minutes apart, apparently in a coordinated attack on Saturday night, left dozens dead. One involved the detonation of a car, the other a suicide attack. The location, a football stadium in the heart of Istanbul. The attack took place an hour after a match. Images of police helmets scattered around the blast site left the country in tears. This is the stadium where the explosion took place. Hundreds of riot police were stationed here to protect Turkish football fans. But it was them who became the target and victim of the attack, as most of those who were killed were police officers. Turkish President Erdogan condemned the attack.
Terör belasıyla
Our nation, my people, should have no doubt we will continue with our fight against terror until the end. They will pay a heavy price for this.
A funeral was held in Istanbul for 5 of the police officers killed. Men in tears carried the coffins wrapped with the Turkish flag. A number of people have been taken into custody.
We have no doubt that the separatist terrorist organization PKK is behind this attack. We have several people detained, and a legal investigation is underway.
Meanwhile, the Kurdistan Freedom Hawks, known as the THAAD, an offshoot of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, has claimed responsibility with a statement on its website, saying it was in retaliation for violence in southeastern Turkey and the imprisonment of PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. The group, along with ISIL, are also blamed for previous attacks in Turkey. The Turkish Interior Minister said this latest incident will not discourage the country but, quote, to the contrary, bring us together as a nation. Michal Bardavid, CCTV, Istanbul.
So how well can Turkey stamp out the terror threats in Beijing? Yan Shuai, analyst of Anti-Terrorism Center at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. In Ankara, Turkey, we are joined by Professor Selçuk Çalhanoğlu, who is a professor in the Department of International Relations and also a former advisor for the Center of Strategic Research for Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In Washington, D.C., we have Dr. Bülent Alireza, a director and senior associate with the Turkey project of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. First of all, Professor Çalhanoğlu, how much do we know about THAAD, the group that has claimed responsible for the bombings? In fact, are they really related to PKK? At this moment, it seems it is still not necessarily a done description.
Yes, actually, the THAAD usually have some operational fields in the urban area, usually the cities in Turkey. So, and also the THAAD is claiming that its target basically for military, police, or government buildings. But as you know, if there is a terrorist attack or if there is an explosion in a city or in an urban area, so the civilian casualty is very highly likely. So that's why the THAAD is claiming responsibility in only urban area with some civilian casualties, despite they targeting the military and police targets. But actually in Turkey, the THAAD is considered as a PKK affiliated organization, and also PKK is used this THAAD name in the case of the civilian casualties. So in Turkey, THAAD is considered as a PKK affiliated group in general.
Well, in Turkey it is being considered. What about from your perspective, Dr. Alireza?
Well, clearly there are connections between the
Actually,
two.
this is very common.
Dr. Alireza,
When
please.
we compare the... Okay.
Yes, just to reiterate, clearly there are connections between the THAAD and the PKK. There are a number of statements by PKK leaders, and the very fact that the THAAD, in its announcement of its claim that it was responsible, referred one to the imprisonment of the PKK leader Öcalan, and secondly to the ongoing military operations by the Turkish government in the southeast of Turkey against the PKK and its affiliates, confirms that the linkage. But to put it into the broader context, I think the fact that there isn't an ongoing peace process between Turkey and the Kurds, the fact that the Kurdish political party is no longer acting as the representative of the Kurds, and the fact that the PKK is stepping up its attacks, not just in the southeast, but the rest of the country, makes one somewhat despondent about the possibility of the end of this kind of attack in the near future.
Well, we understand that from Turkish side, the president and also the country's military machine, has not been hesitating to fight terrorism to the last man. However, the previous anti-terrorism efforts, especially in clamping down on the Kurdistan Freedom Hawks, or THAAD, as we mentioned many times earlier, turned out to be a far from effective act. The group's activity dates back to the year 2004. In 2011, they carried out a bomb attack in Ankara, killing 3 people. 2015, they attacked airport in Istanbul, killing 1. Then 2016, they claimed the responsibility for 7 bomb attacks in Turkey from February to December, killing over 140. Professor Çolakoglu, why the government has been very ineffective in clamping down what they believe as terrorists, the THAAD?
Actually, when we look at the Turkey's border, particularly the southern border with Syria and Iraq, so after the eruption of the Arab Spring there, particularly in Syria, and also there is a destabilization also in Iraq, so Turkey has a challenge with some terror-linked groups, and also directly bordering with these groups in Syria and Iraq. So Turkey has border with ISIS, so-called Islamic State, and also Turkey considered PYD as a controlling northern Syria as a PKK-linked group. So Turkey considered that these terror groups, ISIS, PKK, and others, have a very easy access to logistics from Syria and Iraq, and also they have a capacity, increasing number of capacity for militants, and also have good practice there. So they also plus 2014 is a critical and crucial turning point for clashes and civil wars both in Syria and Iraq. So that's why all these developments has a negative spillover effect to Turkey. So Turkish security can hardly control the border against these excess of terror networks. And also, of course, the THAAD or PKK affiliated groups has a chance to get more easy logistics and also more trained militants, and also have increased number of militants easily can access Turkey.
Dr. Ali Reza, I understand you are originally from Turkey, but still I want to have a different perspective coming from you. What exactly is the Turkish government, when you see it doing at this moment, a clamping down on PKK that has been controversial to some governments. Meanwhile, Turkish government's ambition in the region is not hidden from the public either. For example, on the issue of Syria, on the issue of Iraq, and some of the other issues. So how do you see the recent clamping down on THAAD and the series of clamping down on PKK in terms of what Turkish government aspires to do?
Well, you know, I'm speaking from Washington, and the U.S.-Turkish relationship is clearly the most important one for Ankara. And for a long time, Ankara could rely on the United States to give full support in its war against the PKK. Washington, like Ankara, considers the PKK to be a terrorist organization. One complication that's arisen recently, and I'm afraid this is going to continue, is that the U.S. has been relying on the PYD. Professor Çolakoglu referred to it, the Syrian Kurdish organization, as an ally in its fight against ISIS. And there are links between the PKK, PYD, and THAAD. And so the relationship, the U.S. relationship and U.S. support on this issue is ambivalent. Now, the ISIS fire, if we can call it that, the Syrian civil war, has spread beyond beyond the border into Turkey. The U.S. is supporting Turkey's efforts to deal with it, but frankly, Turkey's ability to deal with the twin threats posed by the PKK and its affiliates and ISIS within Turkey is very limited. Add to it the confusion and the difficult circumstances after the failed coup of July. since when the police force has been focusing on the Gülenist sympathizers. And you've got 3 threats that the Turkish government is dealing with, and it's obviously overstretched. And the fight is no longer confined to the southeast, no longer confined to the Turkish-Syrian border.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's being continued in Ankara and Istanbul.
Mr. Yan, looking afar from China, when you look at the casualties, as we read out earlier, 1 person, 3 person, this time 140 people. Obviously, there's a huge difference between what happened a few years earlier and now. What does that say about the Turkish government's capabilities of clamping down on terrorism inside the country? How is that compared to some of the recent campaigns they've been doing within the country as a result of some of the recent political turmoil in the country? And how should we look at all of these within a big framework of what Turkey wants to do in the region, the role Turkey aspires to play? Mr. Yan, it's a big question, but I think it's a strategic question. I'd like to throw it to you.
Yes, the main reasons behind the increasing terrorist attacks by the PKK is due to the Turkish military clampdown in the southeast part of Turkey against the PKK militants.
Right.
And as in this case, we are seeing there are some loopholes of the limited capacity of the security forces of the Turkish government. There are some loopholes occurred. And just before the attack, the intelligence agencies had been receiving intelligences telling that there may be some big terrorist plot in Istanbul. And also there is a question need to be answered, that how the THAAD managed to bring the car loaded with around 400 kilos of explosives being bring to the center of Istanbul. And also as to the turmoil, political turmoil in Turkey, this definitely have some negative effects on the counterterrorism capacity of Turkey, because after the failed coup, the Turkish government sees the Fethullah Gulen as the mastermind of the failed coup. And also in the Turkish establishment, there are lots of Gulen's followers. So after the coup, the Turkish government stepped up its clampdown on the Gulen's followers. And until now, there are maybe tens of thousands of Gulen followers are arrested or dismissed.
The question is very clear at this moment with all the list you gave to us as to the reason. Dr. Ali Reza, should the Turkish government now reprioritize the tasks facing it in terms of security? Is it internal? Is it external? Is it political, as the president believed so earlier? Or is it something else? And how do you see the president-elect in the United States? As we mentioned in the earlier debate also, he's a very uncertain factor in all relations. Will that factor in Turkey's overall strategic thinking at this moment?
You know, the two are very much connected by the two, the two factors you mentioned, domestic and external. Turkey, with the backing of the Obama administration, particularly after 2011, got involved in the Middle East, and did so with the support of the U.S., as I said, in trying to encourage the transformation throughout the Middle East. Now, of course, it's the wind is turned. Assad is about to defeat the Turkish-backed opposition fighters in Aleppo, and I'm afraid all of those people are going to run away to Turkey, adding to the security concerns. And domestically, as I said, the PKK issue has been with Turkey for 30 years, and it's getting worse. The Syrian civil war is spreading into Turkey because Turkey's desire to play a major role in the Middle East is being undermined, and in fact, with the tide reversing, it is now posing a challenge within Turkey itself. And as for the president-elect, there was a conversation between President Erdogan and President-elect Trump, but it's unclear which way Trump is going to go. But Trump clearly wants to cooperate with Putin in Syria. Trump wants Assad to win that war, and Trump is very concerned about Islamists, not just the terrorists who act in the name of Islam, but also political Islam. And I'm not sure that the relationship between Ankara and Washington is going to develop in a good way as people in Ankara hope.
Mr. Yan, what does that mean for the overall global fight against terrorism with what Mr. Dr. Ali Reza just mentioned?
Yes, because the Trump may have some different strategy against the terrorism. Maybe Trump may seek the Assad regime to fight against the Islamic State, and while the Turkey is seeking to topple the Assad regime. So after the new Trump government came to power, the Turkish and the U.S. Relations on combating terrorism may become widened, and that may cause a lot of complicated results.
And Professor Çalhanoğlu, before we go, 20 seconds for you for your thoughts.
For Turkish side, of course, Turkey has some difficulties and problems for this year, and also there is a discussion right now in Turkey. There is a debate on the system change in Turkey. So there are lots of, how can I say, challenges and opportunities together. But at the same time, the terrorist attacks, especially throughout 2016, have a negative effect for Turkey's optimism in general. But I think Turkey can manage all these difficulties within the national unity.
Okay, Çalhanoğlu, we have to go. Bülent, Ali Reza, Yan Shuai, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the program, visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.